Her hands are growing. Alice stares at them as her fingers stretch and her knuckles swell like balloons filling with air. She tries to stop it, but she cannot. Her head hits the ceiling as the room shrinks around her, or perhaps she is expanding into it. She does not know anymore. A little girl chases a white rabbit down a hole and tumbles into a world where her body betrays her without warning. Her hands grow massive, then shrink to nothing. Playing cards scream for her execution, and time itself shatters into pieces. What appears to be an innocent children's tale contains within it the documented horrors of Victorian England's darkest era. The seals are breaking tonight. Another buried truth is crawling from its grave. This is the Pandora's Project, where stories that were locked away, sanitized, and buried are finally breaking free. Alice in Wonderland was never meant for children at all. While Lewis Carroll penned his famous story, thousands of workers stood in the steaming hat factories of Manchester and Birmingham. They breathed mercury vapor with every shift, unaware that the metal was destroying their minds from the inside. Their hands developed uncontrollable tremors. Their thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. Many ended their days locked in psychiatric wards, forever trapped in confusion. The author transformed their tragedy into a character, the Mad Hatter, eternally frozen at 6 o'clock tea time. But the Mad Hatter was only one dark secret woven into his narrative. Alice in Wonderland is not a story about whimsy and magic. It is a chronicle of control slipping away, of identity dissolving like sugar in water, of a society that treated human beings like playing cards, replaceable and easily discarded. The descent into the real Wonderland begins now, where every talking creature masks a documented truth about human suffering, where each strange encounter reflects the deepest terrors Victorian England tried to hide, and where Alice's journey ends not in fantasy, but in the chilling recognition that madness waits just one step away from all of us. If this journey into forbidden history intrigues you, leave a like. Subscribe to the Pandora's Project so the next seal that breaks does not go unwitnessed. More disturbing revelations behind the stories that shape childhood are waiting in the dark. But understand this: after tonight, Alice will never look the same again. What other classic tales are hiding horrors in plain sight? Share your thoughts in the comments. Part 1. The White Rabbit. Everything changes with a single choice. Alice spots the white rabbit clutching his pocket watch and vest, and without hesitation, she runs after him. In that moment, her entire world shifts, but she has no idea she is following a symbol into darkness that had already consumed millions of souls across England. The white rabbit races past her with eyes wild with panic, checking his watch every few seconds. "I'm late. I'm late," he says, his voice trembling with fear. Not whimsy, terror. Pure, desperate terror of what happens when you are late. Manchester, 1858, before dawn at the factory gates. Hundreds of workers are already waiting in darkness at 5 o'clock in the morning. Their faces are hollow from exhaustion, and their eyes are dead from despair. The gates open, and they do not walk. They run, racing to their stations before the foreman marks them late. Being late means docked pay. Being late means dismissal. Being late means starvation. The white rabbit, with his frantic movements and his panicked cry of being late, was not some charming storybook animal. He represented something far more sinister, the living reflection of an entire generation transformed into ghosts by the Industrial Revolution. They ran like the white rabbit, perpetually late, perpetually gasping for breath, perpetually fleeing something they could never outrun. Time had transformed into their greatest enemy. The rabbit hole Alice leaps into is far more than a gap in the earth. She falls and falls through absolute darkness with the walls rushing past too fast to grab. No bottom is visible, and she has no sense of how far she has dropped or how much further she has to go. This serves as a gateway into a reality the author experienced firsthand through his severe migraine attacks. A reality where time freezes, where proportions make no logical sense, where everything solid melts like wax held too close to flame. These attacks plagued him throughout his entire existence, and they granted him glimpses into states of consciousness most people would never encounter. Alice does not simply follow the rabbit physically. She follows him into the depths of what it means to exist as a human being in a world designed to devour you. The white rabbit embodies every person who spends their life battling against time itself, never realizing the battle was lost before it began. The faster they sprint, the further they drift from what they truly sought. Medical records from that period document hatmakers describing the identical sensation, a feeling that time itself had turned hostile. They started their morning shifts with clear minds, but the mercury they inhaled altered their perception of hours and minutes. By the end of their shifts, they could no longer distinguish whether they had worked for moments or for years. These men became replicas of the white rabbit, ensnared in a cycle of fear, always in motion but never liberated. They could not stop running because stopping meant being crushed beneath the industrial machinery that held all of England in its iron grip. The rabbit hole transforms into something far darker than a simple passage between worlds. It marks the exact moment when a person understands that the world they inhabit will never acknowledge them as complete human beings. Alice pursues the rabbit into a reality where people are reduced to mere functions, to cogs in a machine that never ceases its grinding rotation. And as she plummets through the hole, through absolute darkness and into the unknown, a question waits at the end of her fall that is more terrifying than any physical descent. A question that haunts every person who has ever lost control over their own existence. Part 2. The Caterpillar. When Alice finally stops falling, she discovers herself in a world where nothing remains solid and nothing stays reliable. Then she encounters the caterpillar, perched on its mushroom and surrounded by clouds of smoke. The creature poses a question that slices through her consciousness like a blade. Who are you? Alice opens her mouth to answer, but nothing comes out. She was Alice when she woke up, she thinks. Was it this morning? She has been tall, small, different, herself, someone else. The words disintegrate like soap bubbles in air. She cannot respond because she herself no longer possesses the answer. In Wonderland, identity behaves like liquid mercury. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it escapes through your fingers. The caterpillar understands something Alice has not yet grasped. Transformation is not merely inevitable, it is essential for survival. But what the caterpillar withholds from Alice is the cost of this transformation. In the hospitals of London during the Victorian era, there were patients who asked this identical question daily, not from curiosity, but from genuine, desperate confusion. They suffered from a condition their physicians labeled alienation of the soul. Today, we recognize it as depersonalization, the sensation of being a complete stranger inhabiting your own body. These people looked into mirrors and failed to recognize their own faces. They heard their own voices speaking and could not identify where the words originated. The author of Alice experienced these states personally. His migraine attacks threw him into altered consciousness where his body felt alien, where his hands suddenly appeared gigantic or microscopic. These episodes granted him insights into a medical reality that would not be properly understood for decades to come. What he documented in his story was a real neurological condition. Children and adults continue to suffer today from this disorder where perception of body size becomes completely distorted. Patients report their hands swelling to enormous proportions, their legs stretching endlessly, or themselves shrinking to tiny sizes while the world around them becomes a threatening landscape of giants. Medical archives from the 1860s contain numerous case reports of children who described experiences disturbingly similar to Alice's adventures. One boy reported feeling as tall as a church tower while his fingers appeared thin as sewing needles. One girl described furniture in her room that seemed to grow and shrink in rhythm, as if the room itself was breathing. But these children were not believed. In Victorian England, a child reporting such experiences faced immediate suspicion. Parents brought them to doctors who diagnosed hysteria or moral weakness. Many were sent to institutions where they spent years, sometimes entire lifetimes, locked away from society. Records show that families whose children had been institutionalized for describing what doctors called impossible experiences were common throughout this period. What these children reported was not fantasy or lies, but genuine neurological events their primitive medical science could not yet explain. The caterpillar's question, "Who are you?" becomes infinitely more sinister when you understand it was a question real Victorian children were forced to answer to doctors, to parents, to authorities who held absolute power over their fates. A wrong answer, a description too strange, could mean permanent institutionalization. Alice's confusion about her identity mirrors the confusion of countless children whose neurological conditions were interpreted as moral failings or mental defects. The Victorians believed strongly in the connection between physical symptoms and spiritual corruption. A child whose body behaved strangely must have a corrupted soul. The mushroom the caterpillar sits upon offers Alice the ability to control her size. One side makes her grow and the other makes her shrink. She takes a piece from each side and her neck stretches until her head is in the treetops. She has lost control entirely. This is not empowerment. This represents the Victorian medical treatment approach, crude and dangerous, where doctors prescribe substances without understanding their effects, where children were given mercury and arsenic and opium to cure conditions that were never properly diagnosed. The smoke surrounding the caterpillar represents the fog of Victorian medicine, where treatment was often more harmful than disease, where desperate parents tried remedy after remedy on their suffering children, where the line between cure and poison was invisible. Alice stands before the caterpillar, unable to answer who she is, because in that moment she embodies every Victorian child whose reality was dismissed, whose experiences were denied, whose identity was stripped away by a medical system that labeled them defective. What Alice does not understand yet is that the caterpillar's question will haunt every person who loses grip on reality. Part 3. The Mad Hatter. The tea party never ends. The clock is frozen at 6 o'clock, and 3 figures sit around a table covered in broken cups and scattered crumbs. The Mad Hatter, the March Hare, and the Dormouse are trapped in an eternal afternoon, asking riddles with no answers, celebrating unbirthdays, pouring tea that never satisfies. The Mad Hatter lifts the teapot and his hands shake as tea spills. He does not notice. Why is a raven like a writing desk? He asks the riddle again. He has asked it 17 times already, but he does not remember asking it before. In the hat factories of Manchester and Birmingham, workers used mercury nitrate to process felt for hat production. The chemical was essential to the craft, and it was slowly, systematically destroying every person who worked with it. The mercury vapor they inhaled accumulated in their bodies, concentrating in their brains, attacking their nervous systems without mercy. The first symptoms appeared subtle, a slight tremor in the hands, difficulty forming words, moments of confusion that passed quickly. The hat makers dismissed these signs as fatigue, as the natural result of long hours and difficult work. They had no understanding that the mercury was building in their tissues, that every shift brought them closer to permanent damage. As months became years, the symptoms intensified. The tremors spread from hands to arms to entire bodies. Speech became slurred and difficult. Memory fractured. Personality changed. The cheerful craftsman became irritable, then paranoid, then violent. The careful worker began making mistakes, then could no longer work at all. Medical journals from 1850 through 1870 contain hundreds of case studies describing hat makers admitted to psychiatric institutions. The pattern repeated identically. Patient exhibits uncontrollable shaking. Patient speaks incoherently, mixing words and thoughts without logical connection. Patient experiences vivid hallucinations. Patient becomes aggressive without provocation. Patient deteriorates rapidly once symptoms begin. But the doctors did not understand the cause. They blamed moral weakness, inherited madness, spiritual corruption. They prescribed treatments that made everything worse, bleeding and purging and isolation. The hat makers were locked in asylums where they spent their remaining years, sometimes decades, trapped in confusion and terror. These men had been sacrificed to industrial profit. Their employers understood the mercury danger and chose production over human life. Documents from the period reveal factory owners received warnings about mercury toxicity, but continued operations unchanged. The hat makers were expendable resources, easily replaced when they broke. The Mad Hatter sitting at his eternal tea party serves as a tribute to these destroyed men. The character's nonsensical riddles reflect the fractured speech patterns of mercury poisoning. His erratic behavior mirrors the personality changes documented in medical archives. His inability to move past 6 o'clock represents the frozen moment when mercury damage becomes irreversible, when the person you were ceases to exist. The tea party itself holds darker meaning. In Victorian England, tea time represented civilization, order, proper social behavior. The Mad Hatter's tea party is civilization destroyed. The rules still exist and the rituals continue, but nothing makes sense anymore. It is society performing its functions, even as those functions become meaningless, just as the hat makers continued working, even as the work was killing them. The March hare and the dormouse represent the progression of mercury poisoning. The March hare still has energy, still moves and speaks, but his actions lack logic. The dormouse can barely stay conscious, constantly falling asleep mid-sentence. This is the trajectory every poisoned hat maker followed, from initial symptoms to complete mental collapse. The Hatter's famous line about why a raven is like a writing desk has no answer, because mercury poisoning has no cure. Once the damage reaches a certain point, there is no recovery, no solution, no escape. The riddle without an answer is the hat maker's life, destroyed by a question that cannot be resolved. Victorian factory owners knew about mercury poisoning. A letter survives from 1867. Factory owner to business partner. The mercury does affect the workers' minds after some years, but felt production requires it, and hat makers are easily replaced. I see no reason to alter our methods. The hat makers were abundant and replaceable. When one worker became too sick to function, another desperate person would take his place. The system consumed human beings as fuel and discarded them when they broke. The Tea Party continues forever because the Industrial Revolution's victims continue forever. Their names are forgotten, but their suffering echoes through this work, preserved in the Mad Hatter who can never leave his table, can never escape 6 o'clock, can never find an answer to his riddles. The next encounter will show that there is something even more sinister than mercury poisoning itself. Part 4. The Queen of Hearts. "Off with their heads!" The Queen of Hearts screams her command, and playing card soldiers scramble to obey. The sentence comes without trial, without evidence, without reason. The Queen's word is absolute law, and that law is death. Her face is red with rage over a gardener who painted the roses the wrong color, over a servant who brought the wrong tart, over someone who looked at her wrong. The court exists in constant terror, knowing that any moment might bring a death sentence for no reason beyond the Queen's momentary displeasure. Victorian England operated under a rigid social hierarchy where authority figures held absolute power over those beneath them. Factory owners controlled workers. Husbands controlled wives. Parents controlled children. Doctors controlled patients. And all of them could destroy lives with a single decision, just as easily as the Queen of Hearts orders executions. The playing cards that serve as the Queen's soldiers and courtiers carry deliberate symbolism. They represent the interchangeable nature of people in Victorian society. A playing card has a designated value and suit, but individual cards are identical to others of their type. The three of clubs is replaceable by any other three of clubs. The cards have no individual identity, only function. This was precisely how Victorian industrial society viewed human beings. Workers were not individuals with unique value. They were labor units, replaceable when broken, disposable when no longer useful. The factory system required this perspective. Industrial production could not function if owners acknowledged the humanity of people whose bodies were being destroyed to create profit. This systematic dehumanization was visible throughout England. Society discarded people who became inconvenient with terrifying ease. Children who reported strange symptoms were locked away. Workers who could no longer produce were abandoned. Women who failed to conform were institutionalized. The mechanisms of control were absolute and unquestionable. The Queen of Hearts embodies this authoritarian power structure. She rules through fear and violence. She allows no dissent, no questioning, no challenge to her authority. The trial scene that closes Alice's time in Wonderland reveals the true nature of Victorian justice, where Alice is accused of stealing tarts. The evidence is fabricated, the witnesses lie, the jury is intimidated, and the verdict is predetermined. Historical records from the Old Bailey in London show hundreds of cases where poor defendants faced trials that were mockeries of justice, with children as young as 7 convicted of theft based on testimony from wealthy accusers, women convicted of adultery based solely on their husband's word, and workers convicted of destruction of property for participating in labor protests. The sentences were brutal, ranging from transportation to Australia for minor theft, to public whipping for vagrancy, to execution for property crimes. The Victorian justice system protected wealth and power, and it crushed anyone who threatened the established order. Court cases were followed closely during this period. Newspapers documented miscarriages of justice regularly. The legal system was designed not to establish truth, but to maintain control, and everyone understood this reality. The Queen of Hearts screaming, "Off with their heads," reflects the casual cruelty of Victorian authority. Factory owners who allowed workers to be poisoned faced no consequences. Doctors who misdiagnosed and institutionalized children faced no accountability. Parents who abused their children faced no intervention. But a poor person who stole bread to feed their family could be executed. Alice stands before the Queen, facing false accusation and certain conviction, and she represents every powerless person who ever stood before Victorian authority with no hope of fair treatment. The cards that build the house of justice are as unstable and meaningless as the authority they represent, maintained only through violence and fear. Alice grows to giant size in the courtroom and physically overthrows the false trial. She scatters the cards with a sweep of her hand, and they flutter through the air like leaves, powerless, meaningless. This is wish fulfillment, the fantasy of the powerless gaining power and destroying unjust authority. But even in fantasy, this could only happen in stories. In reality, the queens of Victorian England maintained their power, and the playing cards remained replaceable, disposable, and easily destroyed. But why did over 300 children disappear into asylums across London between 1850 and 1870? Part 5. Alice Syndrome. Alice wakes by the riverbank, but something in her eyes has permanently changed. She tells her sister about talking rabbits and endless tea parties, but her voice carries a tremor that was not there before. Wonderland has ended, but it never truly ends. What Alice experienced was not fantasy. It was a documented neurological condition that doctors would not identify and name for another century. The syndrome is real, and it has been terrifying patients since long before this story was written. The condition manifests as severe distortions in perception. Patients experience micropsia, where objects and people appear drastically smaller than reality. They experience macropsia, where everything grows to threatening proportions. Their own body size becomes unstable, shifting without warning. Time perception distorts, with minutes stretching into hours or hours compressing into seconds. Medical journals from the 1860s contain case reports that mirror Alice's experiences with eerie precision. A girl in Liverpool reported her bed growing until it filled the entire room. A boy in Manchester described his hands swelling to enormous size while his body shrank. A woman in London documented time stopping completely, leaving her frozen in eternal present moment. But Victorian doctors had no framework to understand these reports. Without knowledge of neurology, without understanding of migraine-related conditions, without comprehension of how the brain processes sensory information, they labeled these patients as hysterical, delusional, or possessed. The treatments were horrific, including cold water immersion, restraints, isolation, force-feeding, and drugs that made symptoms worse. Many patients were institutionalized permanently, spending decades locked away for experiencing neurological events their doctors could not comprehend. The author of Alice himself experienced these perceptual distortions through his severe migraines. Historical records document his symptoms, the visual distortions, the time perception changes, the sensation of his body transforming. He understood personally what it meant to experience reality becoming unreliable. But he was an educated adult man with social standing. When he reported his experiences to physicians, they listened with respect. They prescribed rest and medication. They never suggested institutionalization. This protection was not available to children, to women, to anyone without social power. The archives at Bethlehem Royal Hospital, London's primary psychiatric institution during the Victorian era, contain records of hundreds of children admitted for reporting impossible experiences. A 7-year-old girl who saw her room breathing. A 9-year-old boy who felt himself growing and shrinking. A 12-year-old girl who described time stopping. These children were diagnosed with various forms of madness. Many spent years in the institution. Some spent their entire lives there. Their families were told the children were incurable, that their minds were fundamentally broken, that institutionalization was the only merciful option. The author visited psychiatric hospitals as part of his interest in medical science. He spoke with doctors and families. He understood that many patients locked away as mad were actually experiencing neurological events that manifested as perceptual distortions. Alice in Wonderland became his way to document these experiences in a form that could reach the public without direct medical accusation. He created a story where perceptual distortions were presented as fantasy, but readers who knew would recognize the symptoms being described. The medical community initially dismissed the book as pure fantasy, but some physicians recognized what was being documented. Letters from the period show doctors writing to the author, asking if he had consulted specific case studies, noting the accuracy of his symptom descriptions. It would not be until 1955 that a psychiatrist named John Todd finally identified and named Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Acknowledging that the perceptual distortions described were real neurological events, not fantasy. By then, more than 90 years had passed since the book was published. 90 years during which countless patients experienced these symptoms and were labeled insane. Today we understand the syndrome is associated with migraines, epilepsy, brain lesions, and certain infections. It is temporary, treatable, and does not indicate mental illness. But for the Victorian patients who experienced it, the diagnosis was madness, and the treatment was lifelong institutionalization. Alice's journey through Wonderland is the journey of every patient whose reality was dismissed, whose experiences were labeled impossible, whose truth was buried under medical ignorance and social prejudice. The story gave these patients a voice through literature when medical science refused to acknowledge them. Final part. The door that should stay closed. Alice returns from Wonderland forever changed, but the rabbits still run, the hatters still pour their poison tea, and the queen still screams for heads to roll. Lewis Carroll did not simply write a children's story. He created a permanent record of Victorian England's darkest truths, the poisoned workers, the institutionalized innocents, the children trapped between reality and neurological chaos. Behind every magical creature hides the documented suffering of real human beings. Behind every strange encounter, the recorded tragedy of a society that consumed its most vulnerable members without hesitation. Wonderland exists in the space between fantasy and documented horror, where truth too dangerous to speak directly was preserved. Wonderland persists today. It waits in the corners of consciousness, in moments when reality becomes too heavy, when identity fractures, when time refuses to move forward. We all recognize the sensation of tumbling through the rabbit hole, in dreams, in illness, in those moments of madness that visit everyone eventually. The story would never reach a final ending, because Wonderland is not merely a location in a book. It is a state of consciousness, an experience of the mind attempting to understand what remains real when everything else collapses around it. Alice's descent is everyone's descent. Her fall is everyone's fall. Her return carries the eternal hope that we find our way home, even when we no longer recognize who we are or what home means. Did you enjoy this journey into the hidden darkness beneath a seemingly innocent tale? Leave a like if these disturbing revelations fascinated you. Subscribe to the Pandora's Project so you do not miss which other childhood stories harbor sinister secrets waiting to be exposed. I have countless more stories to reveal, so many buried truths demanding to be spoken. Wonderland was only the beginning. Have you ever experienced moments that reminded you of Alice? Times when the world made no sense, when you felt like a stranger in your own life? Share your encounters in the comments. The next story you assume is harmless could be another door, another mirror reflecting what lies beneath the surface. Until next time. And remember, if you see a white rabbit at night checking its watch, do not follow. Some doors should remain closed forever.